By late 1944, the war in Europe had entered its final chaotic phase. The Allied forces had broken out of Normandy in the summer, sweeping across France with relentless momentum. Every day brought news of German retreats, collapsing supply lines, and shattered fortifications. Cities that had once been bustling centers of administration and industry now lay in ruins, their streets echoing with the hollow sound of artillery and the cries of the displaced. In this turbulent landscape, the German military relied increasingly on women to maintain its crumbling structure. Female officers, auxiliaries, and support staff served in roles previously reserved for men. They manned anti-aircraft positions, worked as communications operators, and even oversaw logistics for frontline units. Their presence was both practical and symbolic. Practical because manpower was desperately scarce, symbolic because they represented the total mobilization of a society in crisis. Among these women, some held officer ranks responsible for coordinating units, maintaining discipline, and reporting directly to commanding officers. Their daily lives were a careful balance between rigorous duty and constant exposure to the war's unpredictability. Across the Atlantic, the United States had mobilized women in unprecedented numbers. The Women's Army Corps, WSC, established in 1942, integrated women into the military in support roles ranging from clerical work to communications and medical services. Nurses, often attached to combat units, provided frontline care, tending to soldiers wounded in artillery barrages, tank assaults, and urban skirmishes. The WAVs, or Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service in the Navy, handled critical administrative and operational duties, freeing men for frontline combat. These women, trained rigorously, often worked in forward positions close enough to witness the war's brutal realities, but removed from direct engagement with enemy fire. By late 1944, American women were no longer confined to rear echelon duties. They were present near advancing divisions, operating field hospitals, managing supply convoys, and maintaining communication lines that threaded through liberated towns and battlefields. The distinction between traditional gender roles and military necessity had blurred, creating an unfamiliar sight for those still entrenched in the old military culture. Disciplined women serving side by side with men, in uniform on European soil. As the Allies pushed eastward, German female officers encountered an increasingly complex reality. They were no longer solely responsible for administrative tasks within fortified towns or training camps. Retreating units, damaged infrastructure, and the constant threat of air raids forced them into roles that demanded tactical awareness and rapid decision-making. Some directed small detachments of anti-aircraft crews or coordinated civilian evacuations under bombardment. Their training, while initially limited to auxiliary tasks, became a lifeline in an environment where every capable pair of hands counted. This convergence of roles, German women clinging to authority in a disintegrating military, American women asserting unprecedented operational presence, set the stage for encounters that were as disarming as they were historic. The war had reshaped expectations, revealing the adaptability of women in uniform and challenging long-held assumptions about who could wield influence in a military context. In towns across the Western Front, from the Rhine to the Ardennes, this new dynamic began to take shape. German female officers, once assured of their status within a rigid hierarchy, now faced American women whose competence, discipline, and confidence mirrored their own. The stage was set for moments that were both tactical and profoundly human, where the strict lines of combat blurred with the unexpected recognition of shared purpose, resilience, and courage. By early 1945, the situation for Germany was increasingly desperate. The Western Front was collapsing under the weight of the Allied advance, while Soviet forces pressed from the east. Cities such as Aachen, Cologne, and eventually the Rhine crossings became focal points of intense combat, with civilians and military personnel alike caught in the crossfire. German defenses were overstretched, and the role of women in maintaining the military infrastructure became ever more critical. Female officers were not only administrators, they were observers of battlefield movements, coordinators of retreating units, and in some cases, the last line of authority in isolated garrisons. The historical record shows that German women in uniform, primarily part of the Luftwaffe Helferinnen, The Reich Labor Service and auxiliary units within the Wehrmacht were acutely aware of the advancing American forces. Letters and diaries from the period describe a mixture of fear, anxiety, and disbelief. Many had been trained for structured, controlled environments, but the rapid collapse of German defenses forced them into chaotic situations, often with minimal guidance. They encountered bombed-out towns, refugees streaming along roads, and retreating soldiers with frayed nerves. Within this environment, the appearance of enemy forces, especially women, was an extraordinary and disorienting phenomenon. On the Allied side, American women had begun moving closer to the front lines. WACs operated communications hubs in newly liberated towns, nurses managed field hospitals within striking distance of artillery fire, and clerical officers coordinated supply chains critical to the rapid advance. First-hand accounts from these women described the mixture of adrenaline and apprehension that came with each forward deployment. Their uniforms, neat, professional, and unmistakably authoritative, projected competence, defiance, and the unmistakable symbol of an unstoppable Allied momentum. One documented encounter occurred near the town of Remagen in March 1945, where German officers, including women, observed American units crossing the Rhine. Among them were women in uniform, supervising logistics and medical operations. Contemporary testimonies suggest that German officers were struck not only by the strategic importance of the crossing, but by the sight of women confidently navigating a domain previously considered male only. For many, it was a moment of cognitive dissonance, a recognition that their own world, disciplined and rigid, was being confronted by a force that embodied both equality and authority in unfamiliar ways. Other reports from Bavaria and the Rhineland describe similar moments. German female officers trained to maintain composure under stress found themselves visibly emotional at the sight of their counterparts. Some wept silently in quarters, others remained stoically shocked on street corners, unable to reconcile their understanding of military hierarchy with the reality before them. Archival photographs, letters, and military reports corroborate these encounters, highlighting the psychological impact that American women had on the German military psyche, particularly among those serving in auxiliary and command roles. These interactions were not merely symbolic. They had tangible consequences for German morale and decision-making. The presence of American women in operational roles challenged the illusion of invincibility that German officers had relied upon, particularly in isolated garrisons and towns cut off from reinforcements. It signaled a new type of threat, one that was not just tactical but psychological, eroding confidence and accelerating surrender in some instances. The realization that the Allies had integrated women so fully into the military apparatus underscored Germany's increasingly precarious position and highlighted a broader shift in warfare, where traditional gender roles were being redefined under the pressures of total war. By the spring of 1945, as American troops pushed deeper into Germany, encounters between German female officers and American women became more frequent. These moments, often brief and rarely dramatic in a conventional sense, were charged with intense human emotion. Awe, fear, disbelief, and reluctant respect coexisted in small towns and makeshift military compounds, leaving indelible impressions on both sides. The war's brutal efficiency was mirrored in these encounters, but so too was a quiet testament to resilience, adaptability, and the unforeseen ways in which women could influence the course of conflict. The stage was now set to examine these encounters from multiple perspectives: the human, tactical, technological, and moral angles that together illuminate not only the shock of these meetings, but their broader significance in the waning months of the European War. The human element of these encounters cannot be overstated. German female officers trained in discipline and hierarchy were suddenly confronted with women who embodied authority, competence, and courage in a foreign uniform. Diaries and letters from 1945 reveal moments of shock and vulnerability. An officer describing a strange, disquieting respect, or another noting that tears came unbidden at the sight of American women calmly supervising medical stations amid chaos. These reactions were not weakness, they were a reflection of the human capacity to be unsettled when confronted with the unfamiliar, especially in a context defined by survival and rigid expectation. For the American women, the experience was equally profound. They had been trained to navigate a male-dominated military structure. Yet now they were entering territories where fear, suspicion, and decades of cultural assumptions about gender awaited them. Field reports and personal accounts describe nervous glances exchanged across ruined streets, tense introductions, and moments where uniforms alone communicated authority and command. These encounters were a silent exchange of human emotion, courage, apprehension, and mutual recognition of the hardships endured by women in war. From a military standpoint, the integration of women into operational roles had concrete implications. German officers had to reassess assumptions about frontline dynamics and rear area security. American women served as crucial links in communication networks, medical services, and logistical chains, often operating near combat zones. Their presence demonstrated that the Allies were mobilizing every available resource, not merely relying on traditional combat troops. German female officers, in turn, were increasingly called upon to coordinate movements of retreating units, manage anti-aircraft crews, and maintain civilian compliance under bombardment. The psychological impact of seeing the enemy's women operating in highly competent, organized roles could not be ignored. It disrupted expectations and forced a recalibration of perceived power and control. Uniforms, communications devices, and operational equipment played an unexpectedly symbolic role. American women were often seen operating radios, field telephones, and even vehicles that German officers were trained to respect, but not expect women to handle. Photographs from liberated towns depict WACs managing radio operations under fire, or nurses directing ambulance convoys with precision. These images left a lasting impression. The sight of women engaging with technology traditionally associated with male soldiers challenged long-held assumptions about capability and authority. Similarly, German female officers, trained to oversee technical units like anti-aircraft batteries or signals operations, recognized the expertise of their counterparts. The encounter became a subtle, silent contest of competence, where the mastery of technology became a vehicle for asserting presence and influence on the battlefield. Leadership manifested in unexpected ways during these interactions. American women demonstrated authority through calm command of their duties, maintaining order under chaos, and ensuring that operations ran smoothly despite the proximity of conflict. German female officers, once secure in their authority within the Wehrmacht hierarchy, were confronted by a parallel structure, women who led by competence, not rank alone. This disruption of expectation had profound effects on morale. Officers accustomed to unquestioned authority found themselves observing American women making decisive contributions to the Allied advance. In some cases, this led to introspection. In others, it intensified feelings of disorientation, awe, or even resignation. Leadership in this context was no longer solely tied to rank or uniform. It was measured in action, composure, and the ability to shape events amid uncertainty. The presence of American women in uniform also carried a subtle but profound moral dimension. For German female officers, it challenged long-held narratives about gender, power, and the enemy. They had been indoctrinated to view the Allies as faceless adversaries, but seeing women capable, disciplined, and in positions of responsibility humanized the enemy in an unsettling way. Reports and personal diaries describe conflicting emotions, admiration mixed with resentment, fear intertwined with reluctant respect. These encounters revealed that the human capacity for resilience and leadership transcended national or ideological lines, a realization that unsettled some and inspired others. The psychological impact was tangible. Morale, already fragile due to retreat and loss, was further complicated by the recognition that these women were competent, fearless, and operationally effective. It was no longer a purely male combat scenario. The battlefield had become more complex, and traditional assumptions about strength and hierarchy were being challenged in real time. The emotional resonance of these meetings extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. German officers' reactions, often silent tears, stunned stares, or quiet murmurs, reflected the cumulative stress of years under total war and the sudden confrontation with the unfamiliar. For many, it was an awakening to the broader possibilities of women's roles in society even amidst destruction. For American women, the emotional weight was different, but equally powerful. They were aware of the symbolic impact their presence had. To see enemy officers, especially women, confronted with their authority and composure, underscored the social and psychological dimensions of the war effort. Letters sent home often highlighted this awareness, noting the mixture of fear, surprise, and respect they observed in German personnel. These encounters became small but potent narratives of humanity amid widespread devastation. From a strategic perspective, the involvement of women in operational roles facilitated Allied advances in crucial ways. They freed men for frontline duties, ensured that communications and logistics flowed without interruption, and provided medical care that directly affected combat effectiveness. The integration of American women into the military structure was not merely symbolic, it was an operational advantage that German officers could not ignore. This strategic reality forced German female officers to reassess their own capabilities and the limitations imposed by rigid command structures. In many instances, the realization that the enemy could mobilize all available human resources, regardless of gender, reinforced the inevitability of defeat. The presence of American women became a quiet but powerful force multiplier, altering perceptions of power, capability, and the trajectory of the final months of the war. These encounters were emblematic of a broader shift in the nature of warfare and gender roles. They highlighted the ability of women to contribute meaningfully in combat-adjacent roles, challenge traditional hierarchies, and shape both morale and operational outcomes. Historians note that such moments were rarely dramatic in the conventional sense, but carried lasting implications for military organization, gender integration, and post-war societal perceptions. By spring 1945, the encounters between German female officers and American women in uniform had evolved from rare anomalies into a recurring, psychologically significant phenomenon. The awe, respect, and disorientation they inspired would leave traces not only in personal diaries and letters, but in the broader narrative of the war's final phase, illustrating how humanity and competence could transcend ideology, nationality, and expectation. March 7, 1945. The town of Remagen, perched on the eastern bank of the Rhine, became a focal point of one of the final, dramatic intersections between German resistance and advancing American forces. The Ludendorff bridge, battered but still standing, offered a crucial crossing for Allied troops. German commanders, including female officers responsible for anti-aircraft defenses and communications coordination, had been tasked with delaying the American advance at all costs. Amid the chaos, American women in uniform were present in full operational capacity. Nurses moved swiftly among makeshift aid stations, treating the wounded with a calm urgency. Communications officers, many of them WACs, monitored radio transmissions, coordinating artillery support and troop movements with precise efficiency. Observing from a nearby German observation post, female officers saw these women executing tasks that required technical skill, composure under fire, and command over resources, all within sight of the battlefield. The impact was immediate and visceral. German officers, trained to view authority through rigid hierarchy, felt the disorienting force of an unexpected mirror. Women, not subordinate staff but active participants, shaping the flow of battle. Contemporary accounts describe officers blinking against the cold March wind, hands frozen not just by frost but by disbelief. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed by a mixture of fear, admiration, and a dawning sense of inevitable defeat. The clash of uniforms, gray and olive drab against the pristine American ensembles, symbolized a larger confrontation, not only of nations, but of assumptions, roles, and power itself. The intensity of the moment escalated as American units advanced across the river. Artillery shells exploded nearby, sending shards of stone and earth into the air. Amid the detonation, German female officers maintained their posts, attempting to coordinate responses with a precision born of habit and training. Yet each glance toward the riverbank revealed women in the enemy ranks, steady, confident, and operationally indispensable. The psychological pressure compounded. This was no longer an abstract idea of Allied women in the military. It was a tangible, undeniable presence influencing the outcome of the day. Letters and post-war testimonies reveal the human complexity of these moments. Some German officers later recounted that seeing American women so composed and effective in the field shattered illusions of male-only authority. Others described a deep internal reckoning. They had trained for years to command, to hold power, yet here were women of the opposing army executing tasks with skill equal or superior to their own. It was a silent, emotionally charged confrontation, where awe, fear, and recognition intertwined. In the ensuing hours, as German units faced surrender or retreat, the role of American women became more pronounced. Nurses tended to captured soldiers, WACs facilitated orderly processing of prisoners, and clerical officers ensured the smooth functioning of supply lines that continued to advance. The German female officers, witnessing these capabilities firsthand, experienced a psychological turning point. The inevitability of defeat was paired with the revelation that women, once thought secondary in war, could wield influence as profoundly as any soldier on the front line. This moment at Remagen was not an isolated incident. Similar encounters unfolded across the Rhine and into central Germany. Women in uniform managing operations, caring for the wounded, and executing strategic functions that German officers could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. The juxtaposition of capability, composure, and gender-disrupted expectations intensified the collapse of morale and symbolized the broader shift in the war's trajectory. The winter light faded into an overcast afternoon, smoke lingering from artillery strikes as German officers finally acknowledged a stark reality. The American advance was unstoppable, and the women in uniform at the heart of it were an undeniable part of that momentum. For these officers, the encounter marked both a tactical defeat and an emotional reckoning, a moment that would define the final months of the European campaign. By late March 1945, the American push into central Germany intensified, and encounters between German female officers and American women became increasingly frequent and consequential. In towns such as Bonn, Koblenz, and Cologne, German officers were confronted with a pattern that both unsettled and inspired reflection. Field hospitals staffed by American nurses were established near the front lines, sometimes within blocks of artillery barrages. Communications posts operated by WACs coordinated the flow of reinforcements, ammunition, and intelligence with a precision that left German observers astounded. One particularly vivid account comes from a German Luftwaffe officer stationed near Cologne. She later recalled that the sight of American women calmly directing ambulance convoys while under sporadic shell fire induced a profound emotional response. We had trained to endure, to command. But never had we seen such resolve, such clarity of purpose in the enemy. I wept, though no one could see, for the world we knew was ending. These moments, often private and silent, revealed the psychological weight of encountering women whose competence defied expectation and whose presence symbolized the unstoppable momentum of the Allied advance. The tactical implications were equally significant. German female officers, once responsible for managing local units and civilian compliance, now faced operational realities they could not influence. Retreating soldiers, seeing American women manage logistics and medical operations seamlessly, often experienced a boost in morale among prisoners or defectors. The visual affirmation that the Allies had mobilized every capable individual, regardless of gender, signaled a total war effort that German officers could neither counter nor ignore. In some cases, these encounters accelerated surrender or disorganization among German units. Small towns previously fortified by the presence of disciplined female officers coordinating defenses capitulated more readily when they witnessed American women confidently managing forward operations. Letters and post-war interviews indicate that the psychological effect of these women, competent, composed, and authoritative, was as significant as any artillery barrage. The collapse of the German command structure was mirrored in the quiet, yet undeniable influence of American women in uniform. Simultaneously, the human dimension continued to unfold. German female officers experienced a mix of fear, admiration, and reluctant respect. Diaries describe moments of silent reflection, tears shed in private quarters, whispered conversations with fellow officers, and letters never sent to family that confessed awe at the courage of their counterparts. For many, the war's reality became inseparable from the recognition that authority, discipline, and resolve were not inherently male qualities. They were human qualities, embodied in unexpected forms. These encounters also had long-term historical significance. They challenged the entrenched perception of women as peripheral participants in combat-adjacent roles. The competence displayed by American women at Remagen, Cologne, and other forward positions demonstrated that operational effectiveness did not rely on gender, but on training, discipline, and courage under pressure. For German female officers, these moments were a collision of military expectation and human recognition, reshaping their understanding of both themselves and the enemy. By April 1945, as Allied forces approached Berlin and the last defensive lines crumbled, the cumulative effect of these encounters was clear. German female officers, once secure in a hierarchy that placed them in positions of relative authority, now found themselves witnesses to a broader, transformative dynamic. Women could influence the outcome of war not merely symbolically but decisively. The emotional resonance, the tears, the awe, the quiet respect was inseparable from the operational reality, and it marked a turning point in both personal and military history. As the smoke of battle began to clear and surrender loomed, these encounters left an indelible imprint. They were not moments of dramatic combat, but moments of revelation. The war's final chapters were being written not only in artillery and strategy, but in the quiet, steadfast courage of women in uniform on both sides of the conflict. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered, and the full consequences of the Allied advance were visible across towns, cities, and military installations. For German female officers, the war's end brought both relief and reckoning. Many were no longer in positions of authority, their roles as coordinators and supervisors rendered obsolete by occupation and the collapse of the military hierarchy. Diaries and post-war interviews recount a mixture of shame, disorientation, and in some cases, reluctant admiration for the American women they had witnessed in the final months. The experiences at Remagen, Cologne, and other key locations remained vivid. German officers described how American women had operated with discipline and composure, often under fire, and how their presence had unsettled the previously rigid German command culture. The emotional impact was evident. Some wept at the realization of defeat, while others reflected quietly on the resilience and adaptability displayed by their counterparts. Letters written by German officers preserved in archives frequently mention unbelievable competence and unexpected courage as defining impressions of these encounters. American women, meanwhile, received recognition for their contributions in ways that extended beyond medal ceremonies and commendations. Nurses, WACs, and clerical officers had played critical roles in medical care, communications, and logistics, ensuring that Allied advances were not merely effective but sustainable. Their presence facilitated orderly processing of prisoners, treatment of wounded soldiers, and maintenance of essential supply lines. Reports from the period highlight that, without this integrated workforce, operational efficiency would have been significantly compromised. The immediate aftermath also saw practical consequences for German personnel. Female officers, many of whom had been captured or surrendered under formal agreements, were processed alongside male soldiers, but were often subject to unique scrutiny. Allied forces noted the dual role these women had played, both as military personnel and as part of a broader social structure that had enabled the Nazi war effort. For some, this meant interviews, interrogations, or temporary detainment. For others, it was an abrupt transition from authority to observer, a sudden confrontation with the consequences of a collapsing regime. Historians examining the post-war period highlight the psychological dimension of these encounters. The awe and respect German officers had felt toward American women were not fleeting. They influenced post-war narratives about capability, gender roles, and the human dimension of combat. The documentation of these moments through letters, diaries, and oral histories provides a unique lens on the end of the European War, illustrating how operational effectiveness and human emotion intersected in profound ways. At the same time, American women were heralded as pioneers in the integration of gender into military structures. Their roles demonstrated that leadership, competence, and resilience were not bound by sex. This acknowledgement had lasting implications. It shaped post-war policies on women in the armed forces, informed the development of military nursing and communications corps, and challenged societal assumptions about women's roles in both conflict and professional life. These immediate post-war consequences naturally lead into the broader societal reflections and the enduring impact of these encounters. The war had ended, but the lessons in resilience, adaptability, and the breaking of traditional boundaries continued to echo. As the Allied occupation of Germany progressed through 1945, the long-term effects of the encounters between German female officers and American women in uniform became increasingly apparent. For many German officers, the war's end was not only a military defeat, but also a personal reckoning. The presence of women in active, competent roles on the Allied side had challenged deeply ingrained notions of hierarchy, authority, and gender, leaving a lasting impression on those who had survived. Post-war interviews frequently describe a quiet, reflective awe, acknowledgement that these women had operated with courage and skill under conditions of intense stress, often while facing mortal danger. The impact on German military culture was subtle but significant. Historians note that the collapse of morale in late-stage defensive operations was amplified by the perception of American women performing duties previously reserved for men. Soldiers and officers alike recognized that the Allies were maximizing every resource, leaving German forces unable to compensate. In this way, the presence of women in uniform had both psychological and operational effects. They were symbols of organized authority, proof of adaptability, and tangible evidence of the Allies' total mobilization. American women, meanwhile, returned home to a country that was beginning to reevaluate the role of women in society. The contributions they had made in field hospitals, communications centers, and logistical operations were widely acknowledged in newspapers, military reports, and public discourse. Their experiences challenged traditional gender norms, providing a precedent for future integration into professional and military life. Veterans of the WACs and Nurses Corps would later reflect that their time in Europe, witnessing the human cost of war firsthand and engaging directly with enemy counterparts, had reshaped their understanding of leadership, responsibility, and resilience. The cultural ramifications of these wartime encounters extended into post-war Germany as well. Scholars and social historians observe that German female officers' experiences, particularly their shock and respect at encountering American women, contributed to post-war discussions about women's potential in professional and civic roles. Letters and memoirs from former officers often emphasize how these experiences broadened their perspectives, illustrating that authority, competence, and courage were not inherently tied to gender but to training, determination, and circumstance. Moreover, these encounters had enduring historical significance. They became case studies in the psychology of surrender, morale, and cross-cultural confrontation under extreme conditions. Archival materials, including photographs, letters, and oral histories, reveal how moments of human recognition, tears shed in silent observation, quiet admiration for competence, intersected with the machinery of war. These small personal episodes, when aggregated, offer a profound insight into the collapse of German resistance, the effectiveness of Allied strategy, and the transformative potential of women in uniform. By the summer of 1945, the war had left Germany physically devastated and socially transformed. For German female officers, memories of encounters with American women persisted as reminders of courage, adaptability, and the unexpected ways in which history could shift. For American women, the experiences reinforced their capacity to operate effectively in high-stakes, male-dominated environments, setting a precedent for generations of military service. The aftermath thus extended beyond immediate military consequences. It shaped perceptions of gender, challenged assumptions about authority and competence, and highlighted the often overlooked role of women in shaping the final months of the European theater. These reflections naturally paved the way to a calm, philosophical consideration of what these encounters meant for humanity, warfare, and the evolution of military culture. The war had ended, but its lessons lingered quietly in the minds of those who had witnessed its final chapters. The encounters between German female officers and American women in uniform were more than tactical events. They were human moments charged with emotion, revelation, and transformation. In the rubble-strewn towns of the Rhineland and beyond, women on both sides had confronted fear, exercised leadership, and embodied resilience in ways that defied expectation. For German officers, the memory of these encounters was a profound reckoning. Authority and competence were not inherently tied to uniform color, nationality, or even gender. Awe, respect, and quiet tears marked a realization that the war's ultimate force was not only measured in artillery or troop movements, but in courage, composure, and human adaptability. For American women, these moments confirmed the capacity to lead, care, and operate under the most extreme conditions, proving that valor and skill were not bound by conventional boundaries. In a broader historical sense, these interactions reflected a subtle but enduring shift. The rigid hierarchies of traditional warfare, the assumptions about gender roles, and the psychological underpinnings of morale were all challenged by women who stepped into roles demanded by circumstance. They became symbols of adaptability, competence, and humanity amidst destruction, leaving an imprint that would resonate in military doctrine, post-war society, and the understanding of human capability under pressure. Ultimately, these encounters remind us that war is not only fought on the battlefield, but also in the quiet recognition of shared struggle, in the courage to confront the unfamiliar, and in the humility to acknowledge excellence wherever it appears. In those fleeting moments, German officers weeping at the sight of American women in uniform, the world glimpsed both the fragility and the strength of humanity, and the enduring truth that valor transcends uniform, nation, and expectation.